Connected to the Caribbean chain known as the Lesser Antilles, the island of Nevis is situated in the Leeward Islands, roughly 1,200 miles from Miami, Florida. Part of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, the island of Nevis boasts about 12,000 English-speaking residents over its 36 square miles. Today, this unspoiled gem has become a welcoming oasis for travelers throughout North America. Peppered with rainforests, reefs, and historic ruins, Nevis offers something for everyone. And accommodations that range from historic plantation inns to mountainside villas and even an award-winning luxury 5-star resort. The beautiful tropical weather plus cool breezes make land sports a daily pleasure. There's biking, cricket, and golf at one of the finest courses in the Caribbean, designed by Robert Trent Jones. Or in the Caribbean Sea, visitors to Nevis can enjoy any number of activities in the warm tropical waters. Whatever your pleasure, you can follow it up with a luxurious open-air massage. Infused with Amerindian, Afro-Caribbean, and European influences, Nevis is a living museum of days gone by. So what is the history of this tropical paradise? Well, Nevis derives its name from none other than Christopher Columbus, who provided the first written account of this beautiful land in 1493. He called the island Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, which means Our Lady of the Snows. The cloud-capped mountains of Nevis reminded the explorer of sparkling snow. Now, as Columbus was sailing for the New World in 1492, the monarchs of this nation issued the notorious Spanish Inquisition.
So 1492 is a pivotal year. Of course, it's the expulsion of the Jews after a series of attempts to integrate the Jews into the community by in 1391, forcibly converting hundreds of thousands of them. That did not work because many of them continued to have a Jewish identity in secret, and in fact the Jews who had not been converted were influencing these converts to return to their ancestral Judaism. And that is what led Ferdinand and Isabel to decide, okay, we have to solve this problem once and for all. We want a unified nation and we need to expel the Jews so they will not influence these conversos, these new converts, and that is why they expelled them.
For Jews, they were presented with impossible choices. You either had to abandon the faith of your fathers and convert to Christianity, or you had to practice Judaism in secret, become a crypto-Jew or a Marrano, or you had to leave the country that you were living in and seek exile elsewhere. If you were a crypto-Jew, and on the surface in your everyday life, you appeared to be following Christian theology, but in your home privately, you retained the religion of your fathers and you practiced Judaism, and you were discovered, you would then face torture and almost certain death, and sometimes that death could be very horrific, where in what was called an auto da fe, people were actually tied to a stake. Sometimes whole families were tied to stake and burnt to death.
Perhaps about half of them went over to Portugal, and then there was a mass conversion in 1497.
And Portugal's Sephardic community, even before the flood of Spanish Jews arrived, made up a vibrant part of Portuguese society, totaling 10% of the overall population, or about 150,000 people.
Those members of the Sephardic community that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula either made homes in North African towns and cities, or in the Levant, as far across as Turkey, or they made their way to northwestern Europe, where a large number settled in what we know of as Holland today, which originally was called the Low Countries, and would have settled in cities like Amsterdam. Amsterdam had the major Sephardic community of northwestern Europe. And then from Amsterdam, of course, once the Dutch conquered the northeastern tip of Brazil, which was held by Portugal, but which, because of the union of the Spanish and Portuguese thrones, had then become part of the Spanish Empire under Charles V. Then you had a Dutch community being set up in Recife in Brazil, in the what is today the states of Pernambuco and Bahia, which were sugar producing states. And because the Dutch were tolerant from a point of view of religion, then a Sephardic community established itself in Recife with 2 synagogues and a vibrant community.
In fact, when Dutch Prince Maurice issued his Edict of Religious Toleration, New Holland, the Dutch name for their colony in northeast Brazil, became the first legal settlement for Jews anywhere in the New World. And when the Sephardic community in Recife consecrated the Kahal Zur Israel Synagogue in 1636, the temple became the first Jewish congregation in the New World. And some historians estimate that at its peak, Dutch Brazil had a larger Jewish population per capita than even Amsterdam, with the Jews of Recife comprising 35% of the white population. But the Dutch adventures in Brazil during the 1600s did not last long.
By the late 1640s, the Portuguese were fighting a battle of reconquest aimed at driving the Dutch out of Brazil. And of course, this was achieved. And the Sephardic communities then were faced with the dreadful choice of would they remain in Brazil, and if so, under what conditions would they remain in Brazil? Would they once again become crypto-Jews? Would they become Christian? Would they become subject to the Inquisition and the Ordre da Fé? Or would they leave and go back to Amsterdam or other capital cities in Europe, or do what they did, which essentially was to look for islands in the Caribbean to settle?
So for centuries, the English, French, and Spanish battled for dominion over Nevis. But ultimately, in the early 1600s, the British took control of the island.
Theoretically, Spain claimed the entire Americas. So Spain claimed all of the Caribbean, but they only occupied the islands known as the Greater Antilles. They occupied Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. The smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles were too insignificant for Spain to have an interest in. So by the 17th century, when northwestern Europe, and primarily Holland, England, and France, were looking for colonies in the Caribbean, they then occupied these islands that had not been occupied by Spain.
Such as the island of Nevis. Although the British did have to fight the Spanish to maintain their control over Nevis in the 1600s. But with English dominance, the island of Nevis became safe from the arm of the Spanish Inquisition for descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jews who had immigrated to Holland and then Brazil. Now, the exact date of arrival of the Sephardic Jews on Nevis is not known, but the earliest known reference to a Jewish presence on Nevis dates to a 1677-1678 muster roll for the island, which identifies Isaac Senior, Abraham Rashur, Solomon Israel, Daniel and Rachel Mendez, and their 3 children as Jews. And these Jews quickly became pivotal players in Nevis society.
But we have to consider also the very heavy influence of the Jewish culture on Nevis. We've had, from way back in the 16th century, we've had the heavy influx of the Portuguese into Nevis via the various wars that our countries have entered into. And for Nevis, the Jewish influence has been enormous.
And much of that influence focused on the island's most prolific crop.
That history of the Jewish culture has influenced the economy as well for Nevis, in that during the days of sugar in the 17th century, Nevis was the top country in the Caribbean, sugar producing, economically viable, the head of the economy of the Caribbean. And that we paid the most taxes back to the English community from the the strong economy we had here, and that was Jewish influenced. The crystallization of sugar that was brought to Nevis came through the Portuguese Jews, and that again was a #1 in the Caribbean.
With these tremendous contributions to the island, it should come as no surprise that the Jewish community established a synagogue, a cemetery, and a Jewish school. The site of the synagogue is not known, but the Jewish cemetery continues as a landmark on Nevis, where its signage indicates that in 1720, 1/4 of the population of Nevis's capital of Charleston was Jewish.
Just Jewish cemeteries in the entire Caribbean. It is under the upkeep and care of the Nevis Historical and Conservation Society and the Nevis Island Administration.
The oldest surviving grave marker in the cemetery, Esther Marachi, who died on February 20th, 1679, in the Hebrew month and year of Adar 5439. All total, 19 gravestones can be found at the Nevis Jewish Cemetery, which was refurbished in the early 1970s thanks to the efforts of Philadelphia philanthropists Florence and Robert Abrams. Notably, archaeologist Michelle Terrell recently conducted a land survey in the Nevis Jewish Cemetery, and she believes that at least 44 other burials occurred inside the cemetery, yet their grave markers did not survive. Now, in viewing the gravestones, one can see the beautiful symbolic engravings and tributes etched in English, Hebrew, and Ladino, the Jewish Spanish dialect spoken by descendants of Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain. But like most of the Jews living in the Caribbean in the late 1700s, the Jews of Nevis left the island to help a new nation grow, the United States of America. And when we come back, we will meet arguably the most famous of Nevis's native sons, one of America's foremost founding fathers, and describe his connection to Nevis's Jewish community. We'll be right back.